Hi, so I'm gonna make a video. I don't know exactly what, but I've got some ideas about of what I want to talk about. One of them is art, one of them is religion. That could probably end something cool with you, but they're not exactly very connected. However, I could probably connect them based on what I was doing a Google search on the other day. So I want to think about the purpose of art, and I want to try and figure this out because art is clearly a very important part of human culture, and it has been for as long as I can remember, which is 19 and a half years. Actually, no, I can't remember 19 and a half years ago. I can maybe remember like 16 years at most. Maybe a little bit longer, I don't know. But anyway, so since like ancient humanity and way back before we could even like read and write and use language effectively, we used to communicate through the means of art, like drawing on caves and stuff like that, in order to try and convey ideas. So art clearly has some form of importance, and I guess that is one purpose of art, is to convey ideas, and whether the people were drawing on the caves in order to communicate to future generations, that's if the people of the past, like I don't know exactly what stage they started, but we'll say the cavemen were actually able to foresee that their species was um that their genes were being passed on. They obviously didn't see it as genes being passed on, but they saw that they were having offspring, and then maybe they derived that their children had offspring, and their children would have offspring, and that cycle would keep on going. Based on inductive reasoning, and I don't know if it was necessarily to a great degree of inductive reasoning, but who's to say that the cavemen didn't know that there was going to be generations like way down the line they were going to look at their artwork and then learn from how they were living. That is one explanation, or perhaps that the cavemen were just drawing in order to, I guess, teach and preserve their ideas, because a lot of the drawings were about like killing animals. So there was a lot of men running around with spears and then throwing them at animals. So maybe they were like, "Oh, this is a good idea. This is like how we kill animals. So if we're somehow able to preserve this idea and this way of living, then it will essentially keep our species alive because it's working for us now." So maybe they just wanted to um, ensure that that idea didn't get lost down the generations. And obviously, if the verbal communication wasn't very great, then pictures is a great way to do that, because we can see that even though the pictures that the cavemen were drawing were not extremely intricate drawings and not very realistic, but they were certainly symbolic in many ways. So you could clearly depict that the person carrying the spear was a human being, and that the things that they were throwing the spears at were animals, and so I guess it's like a list of instructions, but in visual form, in order to communicate a message, and that message was very important because it did um, essentially keep the species alive. Like if we didn't have spears, then we or weapons or tools, then we wouldn't necessarily have got so far, because that's what we use in the modern day. And maybe weapons aren't so important now, aside from war, but weapons aren't as important because we've got supermarkets and agricultural um, industries and stuff like that, whereby we can get our food served to us that way. But obviously back then, and for many years, again, I'm trying to stay away from the chronological aspect of this because I don't know the exact time period, but yeah, it clearly did. It was a prerequisite to the survival of our species in many ways. So I think that's one purpose of art. But now we still have art in today's society, but it's definitely evolved and developed alongside humanity. So as humanity has become, I'm going to say, more complex, or our minds have become more complex, or grown larger, and we have a greater capacity, we're able to create greater artwork, and we still use this artwork to convey messages in many ways. And that could be political messages in the form of propaganda, or it could just be deep messages about human nature, which are extremely hard to encapsulate with verbal language or written language. And yeah, so I think art does have that sort of purpose, but that makes it sound almost trivial. Like, it just conveys something about humanity, but is that trivial? I don't know. Like, for me, like, because, like, I like creating art, but it's not always just something that I want to do. It's not like, oh, I want to draw a picture today. Sometimes it's more of a necessity. It helps me sort down the information that's in my mind, and I'm just able to put it down on paper, and it just gets out there. And I can use writing as a means of doing this as well, but it's a different sort of experience. Like, because when you write, it's like you're actually you do a different thing to that which you do when you draw. Like, drawing, it can be much more, for me anyway, it can be much more random, and there can be lines and marks everywhere, and it somehow creates this coherent picture. And that's sort of with automatic surrealism anyway, which is probably one of my favourite types of artwork. I don't quite know the purpose of automatic surrealism, but there's this sort of Freudian idea whereby you can draw pictures, and it's like a representation of the subconscious almost. And I think Jung shared a similar view. What did he call it? There was a Freudian free association, which was the idea that you show people certain images which didn't necessarily display anything explicitly, but they had different images within it, and the way in which you interpreted that image suggested something about your personality. So, for example, you could see something sexual, or you could see something demonic, or you could see something good, and that would probably say something about the way that your mind's working at any given time. And those who were going to see Freud were supposedly probably quite mentally disturbed in many ways, because obviously Freud was a psychoanalyst, so he was speaking to individuals who had a lot of mental issues. So a lot of the things that they were seeing would have probably been more on the demonic side or the sexual side. And the sexual side was also one of the things I wanted to link to in relation to religion. So I know that a lot of religions demonize sex, and I don't know exactly why this is, although I can see why it could be. Well, I guess sexual deviancy can lead, in the modern society anyway, in our societies, it can lead to like a breakdown in the family structure, and obviously it's not good for evolution. So if a partner is going to go out and cheat, then that's going to destroy the trust between, say, the woman or the man, and then they're going to break up, and then obviously it's much harder for a single parent to raise children in most situations. So you can see why sex is demonized in that way. Well, I guess the adulterous side of sex anyway. But there's a lot of other things to do with sex as well. Like you could even say sexual orientation. Like, is it necessary that a man and a woman has to raise a child in order for the child to grow up healthy and happy? And I don't know, because well, it just depends, doesn't it? Because like, religions almost assume that some religions assume that we have to suppress our sexual desires towards the same sex, because it's not right, it's not what God intended. God created man and God created woman, and woman and man have to procreate and then have children. And I can see why that is the case, but I don't necessarily believe that people choose their sexuality. Like, I've always been pretty laddish growing up, and yeah, I like girls. Yeah, I don't really like saying that. I don't know why. Maybe I'm not comfortable with my sexuality. But I don't feel like it's a choice. But I still feel bad about it in some ways. Like, I'd just rather be completely straight and just like be able to like just be in relationships with guys and be okay with that. But unfortunately that's not the case. I have relationship difficulties, and as does everybody. But I don't know. I'm going to stop talking about myself for a minute because I don't like this conversation. It's not really a conversation, it's more like a dialogue. But yeah, I don't know. So does God hate gay people? I don't know. I hope not. If God was all loving, then it doesn't make sense for him to hate gay people. And also, I don't really agree with the whole conversion therapy thing. Or the idea that we should have to suppress our sexual desires. Obviously, we have to suppress them to a degree, because we can't just go around raping everybody. I'm not saying I get desires to rape everybody, because I really don't get a desire to rape anybody. I think that's more of a male thing. But yeah, I think that there has to be some sort of sexual boundaries, but whether these should be determined by society or just worked out by the individual, like just on a moralistic level, using reason. I guess you could use the categorical imperative. Is it right to rape people? Would you want to be raped by somebody else? No, then don't inflict that action upon other people. But yeah, so there is. So our actions do impact upon other people in society, and if it causes harm, which is sort of like Mill's harm principle, like we should have absolute liberty unless our action is going to cause harm upon another, and then there should be perhaps state intervention or moral intervention or social intervention in order to demonise that action as being wrong because it's causing harm to another individual. But is homosexuality causing harm? And I guess that comes back to the question as to whether a child who has been raised by homosexual parents can live a good life. And that I don't know. I think they can. Like I think an important thing to outline there would be: is it is a child always raised adequately in a heterosexual within a heterosexual relationship? So if a child's parents is a man and a woman and they have a child, does that necessarily mean that that child is going to grow up to be a well-integrated member of society? Now, that's not necessarily the case, because those parents could be alcoholics, they could have a lot of problems, and then those problems are going to get taken out on the child, and then the child's going to act out and become not a very nice person. So I think there's problems in all relationships, but yeah, I don't know. It's a difficult one, because I feel like there must be a reason why homosexuality is demonized, and is it just because religion is making up some nonsense rules? Or is it actually because there is some sort of moral underpinning to this rule? And I guess we can look at other religious rules and compare it. So does religion make rules which are absolutely nonsensical? And I think it depends on the religion, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to actually think of an example off the top of my head. But I'm sure there are some absolutely nonsensical rules. I guess you could say about abortion, like, because abortion is obviously a bad thing. Okay, it's not good to kill a fetus or a baby or whatever terminology you want to use to describe the boy or girl who's growing inside you. But then it's not necessarily an absolute bad. It's obviously a bad thing to get it done. But, is there a greater good? Like, for example, if that child is a product of rape, or if that child is a product, or if that child is going to be born into a situation whereby the parents are alcoholics or drug addicts, then is it not better to not let that child be born at all? And then you could say, well, the child can go into the care system, but then that's going to create problems for the child, potentially, because the child might grow up with abandonment issues and then perpetuate the sort of struggles that they had to go through in life onto their children. So it can almost maximise suffering in that sense. And also you can argue about the euthanasia debate as well. So religious people who argue against euthanasia might say, well, only God is allowed to take away life, but then those people are also in favour of prolonging life, but that's artificially prolonging life. And is that not against God's will? Because people should just die when they're naturally meant to die, instead of actually intervening medically in order to prolong that life. And I guess you can link to Aquinas' primary precepts and say, well, God intends people to prolong lives because that's just an ultimate good in itself. Therefore, we should do the work of God. But then you're still playing God in some ways, aren't you? Oh, there's so many different angles we can go at with this stuff, and I don't feel like there is a definitive answer, but it's stuff that obviously I've got to keep thinking about. And it's okay that I don't have a definitive answer right now, because You know, I don't think anyone really does have a definitive answer, and the people who do have definitive answers or think they have definitive answers have probably thought about this stuff a lot, or they've just accepted it as a religious teaching or accepted it as a result of perhaps being taught it through some other educational institution, and yeah, that's their belief, and they may have absolute conviction, and if they have absolute conviction, then they are absolutely certain about their belief, and they do know that they are right, but at this point in time, I don't know if I'm right and I don't know if I'm wrong, so I don't think I've even really clearly stated my stance on the issue. I think I've just sort of tried to look at arguments from both sides, and obviously at some point in time I might formulate my own concrete opinion on this or come to some sort of epistemic certainty about the issues at hand, but until that day, I'm just going to have to keep asking questions and thinking about answers and figuring things out. And I'm sure I've got a big chance to do that next year. So, thank you for watching.